the Living 1982 podcast. Were you into the punk scene in the very early 80s or someone who discovered the genre along the way? Well, we're doing some deep diving into the Seattle punk scene and sharing the story behind a band that was very short-lived but made a lasting impact with members going on to being in some of the biggest bands in the world. Their debut album was never released back in the day but is finally out now. This is the story of The Living. Today's episode of The Living 1982 podcast, we are joined by Brian Fox, who was the erstwhile manager of The Living for a number of their days. And today's podcast, we will be featuring infotainment.
Infotainment from Brian Fox. Excellent.
Today's show is infotainment.
Okay, so I have to gather all my memories of The Living and spew them forth for public consumption as the nature of infotainment.
As is the nature.
Okay, well, I'll start right on it. First of all, my moniker as a manager, of course, is relative. But that's kind of my nature back then. I used to come up with some pretty haughty titles to put on records and to call myself so I could be involved in the scene. And when basically I was just the biggest fan of all these bands. I was surprised coming back out to Seattle, where I was born, to see the early, punk rock scene in Seattle in the mid 70s, and then just to see it progress along. And I remember bands when I worked at Peaches Records, your band, for example, the Fastbacks, coming in, and you're just such young kids and everything, and you'd come in and go, yeah, we got a band, we play rock music, and I'm like, oh, that's cute, and then I go out and see the band, and I'm like, wow, this is serious. These guys are bands. So being about 5 years older than a lot of people in the scene, it was just incredible to me to see these people playing this kind of music. And that's kind of how I ended up bumping into the Living. I remember the first time I went to see him down at a gallery in Pioneer Square. I think it was Our Own Damn Gallery. Was that the show?
I think so. I'm not sure if I was actually at that show, but describe that show, and I can't imagine not being at it, but
yeah, I can't imagine you not being at any show, but
right.
This one in particular, yeah, I think I think IE played, or the Radios. Unfortunately, my memory's finally getting bad. As I joked with Brian earlier, I said generally my memory's pretty good because not only was I 5 years older than most people, but I was generally a little more sober. So my recollection of some of these details. But the one thing I do remember, of course, is like all of a sudden there's this band playing out front. It's got a friend, Chris Utting, in it, and Duff is playing drums initially, and Kim Warnick from the Fastbacks is playing bass. And I was just flabbergasted. I'd seen a lot of local bands, but to see a band that really kind of had a stage show, and John would, the singer would shimmy and shake and, throw his microphone around and spin it around in the air and all that. That was pretty impressive. And not only that, to see a band that kind of had, a regular kind of singer. With punk, it was like all things go, and to see somebody who kind of had some chops was kind of interesting. And so I was really impressed. They had a great energy, and they did a breakneck pace punk rock medley of Why Don't We Do It in the Road and Hey Jude. And so they kind of struck me more like Generation X. They were kind of positive, and they weren't really turning their back on the old bands, and they just really had a lot of charisma and energy. So that was my first exposure to Living. I don't know if that was their first show or not. I would assume so.
It must have been. And do you remember what month it was? It would have been, mid 1981.
Oh my goodness. I would think it would be 80, but it could have been 81.
I still have not, I want to get a little map of what was going on in 1981 and 1982 in particular, but there's and I have some posters and I have some things that are related to my own band, but I don't have a lot of things to hang other people's bands on, other than one of the last living shows with Chris was December 11 at St. Joseph's with the Fastbacks and the Silly Killers.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I have that. So, and I think that that might have been their last show before, you know, getting putting out the ad to get Greg in.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting to me because, they actually had quite a bit of history where, Chris would front the band when he was playing his songs, and then Duff would front the band when he was playing his songs, and they both switch off on guitar and drums.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty interesting. That's what the early shows were about. They opened at the Harvard Exit movie theater for 4 hours of Beatle movies, and there's a recording of that. And but for me, being brought in as their manager, one of the things I suggested was that I kind of felt like that switching thing was sort of a novelty, and they took it to heart and decided, to focus on Duff as the front man, and it necessitated having Chris out, not just changing it to Chris being the drummer and Duff being the front man. But as interesting as it was just kind of a gimmick. So I think for the band to get more serious. And as far as me being their manager, actually, it was after that first show down in Pioneer Square, and then I went and saw them at their next show at what is it, Ukrainian Hall or UCT Hall, to put a Queen Anne.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I walk in there.
United Commercial Travelers.
Yeah. So so I walk in there, and the band's already playing, and they had replaced Kim by then with Todd. And of course, who would not be floored walking into a room and seeing Todd up there with a Sex Pistols t-shirt and a cowboy hat and just pounding on that bass. So they really had just extra charisma and energy at that show. And then I was flabbergasted to see all these teenage girls from Roosevelt High like running up and kissing the singer. And I thought, holy shit, this is like some kind of weird local excitement. And John, after that show, asked me to be their manager. And I kind of knew what the nature of being their manager was. It was just like, okay, well, you can be our biggest fan and help us with all kinds of shit, and that will be your duty as a manager, because frankly, a lot of the things that they accomplished themselves, because Duff was very focused. So they, generated these shows in Vancouver on their own. They managed to organize the recording on their own. But I got them a few gigs. I got them to open for the Rats up at the Dragon Palace, I think that was, and things like that. So I helped when I could, but for the most part, I was just around to kind of like, sort out the personality differences and cheer them on, because I was their biggest fan. I just thought this is a punk band with punk energy and really awesome songs. That's one thing that kind of set them apart. I know later on, 10-Minute Warning was kind of given credit. Oh, this is ground zero for, the Seattle sound. And I kind of feel like the Living was more of that. And even the Fastbacks, frankly, because you mine classic rock elements and actually had songs. I don't care how crazy things get, you still have to have a good song. And so I kind of, my hat's off to Living and the Fastbacks, very eclectic, had a wide variety of kinds of rock material, and essentially ended up just being a great rock band, not just limited to a punk band from that time.
Right.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Bloch?
I would agree 100%. In that, going back to the year 1982 and thinking about what all was going on, not just in Seattle, but around the country, and in other parts of the world, I can't really say because I'm not, wasn't tuned into the rest of the world so much, but it does really seem like there was waves of things happening in Seattle that had their parallels in the other cities in America that were doing sort of the same thing, as well as our friends in Vancouver, BC, were sort of going through the same thing, like the punk bands that started as the Cheater, my first band, the Cheaters, in
Yeah, I
19,
saw you guys.
1978. Or I mean, we started in 1977, but our first show was early 1978, and along with a bunch of people that were roughly our age. And your first band, you just gung ho, you don't care. We were so happy to get any show, let alone to be part of the club, the Bird, and friends of the band The Enemy, who were you know not just gung ho, but they were actually doing things and getting out there and going on tour and doing things like that, things that we all wanted to do, but we're a bunch of 17-year-old kids, or I guess my brother
Yeah,
Al was
exactly.
16.
Yeah, the Enemy were a huge presence back then.
Right, because they were doing things. They were
Yeah,
in a van and touring at least the West Coast, and they're going around and doing things. And they sort of took us not under their wing, but they gave us some breaks. I mean, they put us on shows and let us practice a couple times at their practice place, and things like that. Gave us, helped us get started. If it wasn't for them, may have had a break some other way, but they
yeah,
um and so that's enough fuel to keep you going for a couple years. um and then the other bands, like Duff and Andy Fortier, met them sort of in probably about 1979, when they were absolutely still in high school, and getting high school bands together and doing things like that. And their first their first band as actually that played was the Veins, which was Chris Udding, Duff, and Andy Fortier. Chris Udding played
yeah.
guitar. Um, after
Was was
after having a
Cleavage?
failed relationship with Mike Refuser in whatever that band was called, the Thankless Dogs, I
Yeah.
believe.
What about Cleavage? Was Cleavage after that?
Yes. I spoke with Andy Fortier, and Cleavage sort of morphed from the Veins, and parallel to the Veins was the other band with Johnny Vinyl,
Oh, the Missing Links.
Missing Link, which John Conti was in.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
so that
John
was
Vinyl straightened me out on the whole history of all of that because it.
right, and it was back when 6 months was a long time for a band to be together back then.
Yeah,
I mean, you'd get together and you could find, back then, you could find shows instantly, because somebody would be putting on a hall show, and somebody would be, there's really not bar shows other than the Gorilla Room, which
yeah,
you could always
yeah,
get a show there within a week or two of forming your band. And but I mean, everything was just basically a bunch of teenagers doing whatever they can to have an excuse to get together to hang out, practice, and play music. And things like that were enough to go on for a while. But it seems like by about 1982, my computer keeps switching off here. uh it seems like by about 1982, people were maybe just getting a little, it wasn't quite enough to play your hall shows.
yeah. Well, things kind of started opening up because by 83, 84, we had Metropolis, which was huge. Some of these clubs that opened up. In one respect, especially now that I'm an old cruster, it's great to look back at those days when band basically had to take everything, responsibility for everything. You had to go to find some hall, book a show, get a PA, like your flyer looking for a drummer. There was no music papers per se to like, put an ad in. You put things on telephone poles, you put flyers on telephone
Right,
poles.
right.
You go
And
out there, hopefully you can get 10 extra people there because you just blanketed the entire city, driving around at midnight, stapling these flyers everywhere. I mean, it just it's easy to look back to the 60s as being a do-it-yourself time, but man, I'll tell you, that early punk scene, you
yeah, I would
really had
say
to.
1979 to 1982 were as do it yourself as any era in history. And it's
Yeah,
true, you would drive around at midnight with a hammer, stapler, and a bag of posters, and you think, at some point you think, well, we got to do this, and then you think it's like, well, who's actually going to see these things?
yeah,
You try to second guess where people might see your posters,
yeah, yeah,
and maybe, like a street, and if you put up enough of them along a street, if you're driving home after work, then you would definitely be aware of it. But, like one person in, 100,000 had even heard of any of these bands. But then you think, oh, if you make the poster look cool, maybe you could trick them into going, even though they did, maybe it would look like something cool enough to go to that they would go
right,
to it. And I
right,
mean, because that's all you had.
yeah,
That was it. You didn't have any other
yeah.
way to
Plus
do
the
it.
perception of, you couldn't get into like regular clubs because it was still considered, you know, pimply, unruly, unskilled teenage punk bands.
Right,
So
exactly.
getting
And it was
into the
too
regular
loud and
club,
it was out of tune, and well, maybe out of tune, because the tuning sort of sorted itself out as things went on. But it was ratty teenage, punk rock, and the in 1981, the traditional rock clubs were not up for that. I mean, it was
yeah,
not something
exactly.
you even went
I
to.
had to beg. I had to beg to get the living into Hibble and Hyde's, and I could only do that because it was an opening slot for Jim Bass Night, who of course was had easy access to those clubs.
Sure. Who people would
So
actually
I
go to
kind of called
see.
in a chit and said, "Hey, how about having the living open for you?" And but that was it. Trying to get the living booked in any of the normal clubs, which is kind of hilarious. Like I mentioned earlier, the fact that just a few years later, all of a sudden there was a few venues like Metropolis where bands like that could play regularly.
Right,
Decent
all
venues.
ages clubs, and local bands could play there, and they would have all the touring bands that would draw up a few hundred people, would also do well there. And that started probably 1983, maybe.
Yeah, I think about
and,
83. Yeah,
and I'd say the Metropolis is probably the petri dish from which Seattle, the weller known Seattle music scene stemmed from.
sure.
you know um
And I would add that it's interesting that the demise of the living in '82 and then Metropolis starting in '83. It's like there might have been a much bigger awareness of the living had they been playing regularly to Metropolis. But of course, by then Duff and Greg were in 10-minute warning, and they ended up becoming pretty well known by playing Metropolis quite a
sure,
few times
yeah.
amongst
And
other places. So
but my theory is sort of in the breeding grounds of Seattle music, right around, I think 1982 is maybe the time that people were really like, okay, you play with one group of your friends and try to start a band and play some songs and play around for a few months and do your best, and then somebody would get tired, or two people would get in an argument and a fight, and you'd go off and play with two or three of your other friends and start
right, right, right.
and do that. Everybody's trying the different combinations of people and trying different things. Andy went, like I was speaking with Andy the other day. He was like, yeah, I couldn't believe when, because they played together in, was Duff in Cleavage? He was in the,
Duff was in Cleavage, yeah.
yeah, and was Andy the drummer, and Andy was the drummer in that,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
Conti and Jeff Larson, I suppose. and but they're trying some different things, and then Duff and Andy, who were inseparable at that time, they were always in bands together, without a doubt. um you know Duff's like, well, I'm gonna do this other band with Chris Udding and John Conte, who who
Yeah,
had already been in the bands, and Andy went and played, started with my brother Al, the Deans,
yeah, the Deans.
and which were less aggro punk, and a little bit more we have a handful of sort of 60s garage band sound, and they actually did get some shows at regular bars.
Yeah,
And like, people love to play the punk music, but it was really hard. It just seemed like you're banging your head against the wall in some ways to
yeah,
get anywhere. And for a few years, when you start doing that, you're like, yeah, oh, if people don't like this band, it's their problem, we don't care. You can have that sort of feeling, but then after a while you just like, oh, nobody comes to our shows, the same 20 people come to each show. It doesn't matter if we put up 50 posters or 200 posters.
yeah,
The same people come, and nobody from outside of, you could look in the audience and you can name everyone there, because they're the same people that were the last show that you went to. And that was
yeah,
what was great about the Seattle music scene in the early 80s, because everyone did go to see each other's bands, and it was fun, and there was no like, whoa, you got played on the radio and we didn't, so I'm not going to go see you guys. It's like, you wanted anybody to succeed, even if it wasn't your own band. It's like,
yeah,
please, have somebody break out of this thing, and
yeah. Well,
and then
some of those other bands kind of opened the doors. The bands that were a little less threatening, the Cowboys and the Heats and the Allies and the Moberlys and whatnot. And
well, they
so,
they sort of did, but then they sort of didn't either. I mean, they got more people to come see them at bars and clubs,
yeah,
but
they
um
still want to see the Fastbacks opening for them.
and the Moberlys, that first Moberlys record, which you spearheaded for sure, definitely was kicked down a few doors. And
Yeah,
as the Fastbacks 12-inch that came out in 1982 as well, um there was little
yeah, little
steps along the
increments.
way.
Yeah, little increments.
But like the Allies, they ended up moving to New York, probably not long after that, because you just felt like there was, in a way, there was nothing you could do here. Seattle was
Yeah,
just
that was
like a
kind of a lot of people's goals. I know the Blackouts were a big band here in Seattle early on, and they were one of the first bands to get out of town. And pretty much right at the end of the living, Duff was talking about getting out of town, all the time. He saw the writing on the wall, and
right. It just
you know,
just because where everybody was huge music fanatics, and we'd go to all these touring bands shows from out of town, and seeing these bands that were getting somewhere, and everyone wanted to make a killer album. Everyone wanted to have a killer practice place. Everyone wanted a place where they you could practice 4 or 5 days a week. That was part of your thing. You'd read about the other bands. Oh yeah, we practiced. It was our job. That's what we did, is we had this band. And it's like, God, what we would do at that time to have that opportunity.
yeah, oh yeah,
But I mean, you had to have, well, your crappy little job to pay your rent, but all you really want to do is play music. And we're lucky that we did have enough opportunities to play music, but everybody was just looking for something to break out. And the living played a bunch of shows. Do you remember how the recording came about?
um, I think that had something to do with uh, something to do with American music. I can't recall, because as I mentioned earlier, that was something they kind of arranged on their own, and I was just tickled, particularly because they went in there, and they banged it out pretty quick. There was two sessions. There was a later session with a couple things that Duff sang on, And then, is that true that that main session was done at American Music, or was it done somewhere else?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought. But the thing that floored me, of course, was when they came home with the recording. And here I am, I'm already their biggest fan and think they're an awesome band. And then they come home with that recording. I mean, I basically heard it done, finished, and was amazed at what they'd captured. But there's part of me, of course, that wasn't surprised because one thing, as far as the lineage of the living, was seeing them for quite a long time when they had the dual drummer guitar lineup switching. And then I still remember the day I walked over into their practice space and they were auditioning Greg Gilmore, who apparently just moved out from Gig Harbor. And as you well know, anybody that saw Greg drum, particularly back in that era, um, when he was just a polyrhythmic machine, it was quite a thing to see. So to see uh, the power and focus of the living just step up how many more notches when he joined the band, and it turned out to be the right decision, having Duff basically front the band and have this singer and have this powerful drummer, and then Todd working with Greg Gilmore. I mean, it was just, as has been mentioned in a lot of articles recently, it was pretty magic combination. And I think anybody that was here and saw them like we did, has to admit there was a lot going on there, and their shows just kept getting better and more memorable. And
Absolutely.
anything could have happened should they stuck together, but certainly understandable why that would change. And there was no surprise that Duff would move on to bigger and better things one way or another. He was a natural from the beginning, and just hearing the way he played guitar at such an early age, or him as a drummer at an early age. I mean, he was already pretty formidable for the kind of music that was being done. And so, yeah, uh, by the time seeing the original living at the Harvard exit, and then seeing him a year later, at the Dragon Palace open for the Rats, doing a killer version of Ballroom Blitz, by the way. Unfortunately, I don't know of any recordings of it, but what a great live act. And once again, going back to the fact that they had, great songs and a singer and a lot of charisma on stage, it just made them a little more interesting than, say, some of the other aggro punk bands around, like the Farts. And it was also interesting that, towards the end of the Living days, one of the things that surprised me was the kind of cross pollination that went on between the Farts and the Living. They shared a warehouse, like an industrial warehouse. We've talked about that before, where there was the only good place where you could even get remotely good sound was actually being in the elevator to rehearse in this gigantic cavern.
The
But anyway,
facts,
Farts would be
at some
practicing,
point
Living
ended up sharing that spot, that Madison Street.
Yeah.
Oh God, what a terrible.
But things got darker in the Living then, and kind of the direction of punk was a little bit darker then. That's when Black Flag was coming to Seattle a lot and slowing down. And I just feel like a lot of that kind of darker influence, and that's kind of how you end up with 10-Minute Warning.
Yeah, for sure.
Immediately after the Living.
And that was sort of exactly how, Black Flag was clearly a influence on everybody, or a lot of bands back then, because they started out as 100 miles an hour hardcore thing, and sort of went in that direction of heavy music and really depressing, and
yeah,
and certainly
slowing down.
Yeah, well, absolutely. As if you
we bring turgid in.
Turgid
Turgid
of
come
course,
forth.
turgid is the
Turgid,
operative. Yeah. And not surprising that sort of had an effect. Whereas the Living in 1982, that recording is pretty 100 miles an hour. It goes from about 60 miles an hour to 100.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and it's, absolutely fantastic. And Greg, of course, was you know, I think everybody, that wanted to play that kind of music was just not quite, not the combination of people in other bands was maybe not quite up to that. The ability level was not there. And then when Greg joined,
Yeah.
there was no top end to the ability level. And also thinking that what
Yeah.
sort of made the living an awesome outfit is that everybody was, you know kind of going for, it was like the Who, everyone, in the way that everybody was, trying to be the center stage person, either by,
Right.
just playing their
Oh
brain
yeah, yeah.
off,
I see what you mean now.
or
Yeah.
being, right at the edge of the stage. And Duff always
Yeah.
talks about how D.O.A was his, inspiration, to get things going. They were quite like that too. Chuck Biscuits on drums, just, hitting everything, every drum as fast as he could, and Randy Rampage at the
Yeah.
edge
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
stage, and Joey Shithead, doing everything else. It was there, and also Generation X, the British band, was very much
Yeah.
like that too. Everyone,
Exactly.
wanted to be
Everyone had charisma, and there was a lot going on.
right, and everybody wanted to be equal. Everybody wanted to be right on the edge of the stage. And
Yeah.
that was not
Yeah.
typical. I don't know that that was typical in punk bands. In
No.
the best of them it was, but you had to be that, but you also had to deliver the goods too. Just because you were, Sid Vicious standing on the edge of the stage didn't. I mean, I'm not complaining about the Sex Pistols. They were pretty bulletproof in every way, but to be able to do that and deliver the goods in every way was mind-blowing, because it's what we who grew up listening to classic rock bands and stuff, that's what we were missing in punk rock. And to see these,
Right.
the few bands that were doing that had some blazing guitar and had a insane drummer and had a front guy and bass player that was on the edge of the stage and totally letting it rip, was the perfect band, also playing at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Now, few bands could few bands could keep that going, you know
Yeah.
especially in Seattle, when you're playing at art galleries and you could fight your way into a traditional rock club, and people would just stand back there like, oh, what's this? This is too weird for me. So that burning really bright, of course, I remember the Fastbacks record release show that the Living played at down at the Roscoe Louie Gallery, and it
Yeah.
was maybe down the down the steps a little bit and kind of in a window, and the band set up, and we didn't even think we were going to play because half of our band members had quit, the month before. And after the Monroe's Dance Palace show, which was D.O.A, the Fastbacks and the Living, which was a mind
Yeah.
blower of a show.
Yeah. That was a great show. There was a
Um,
great review of that in Desperate Times magazine. Scott
I-
McCoy wrote it, actually.
oh, really? I think I did get the Desperate Times.
Yeah, he was
The
like another, 21 gun salute to Seattle's Motor City Madmen, The Living. Talked about Duff putting his head through the ceiling of the club, and all
right,
that
right, right.
kind of stuff. But yeah, that was pretty cool. That was a great show, and it was great to see him get a little bit of press. I did want to add one thing too. I don't know if we've discussed this, but one of the reasons why I think this Seattle sound developed is because, I've lived in other parts of the country, and I've seen the kind of purity that a lot of their punk music scenes want to have. You got the Chicago sound with a aggro, angular kind of thing. But I kind of feel like the Seattle sound started because out here we didn't really care if it was freaking loud guitars and it rocked. We didn't care whether it was the Sex Pistols or Led Zeppelin or Neil Young or Black Flag. Out here, there just really wasn't any separation. It's
And
like it's raining outside, you're sitting in the basement with a bong, and you're playing all these classic rock albums and all the punk rock albums. To me, that seemed like had a lot to do with the essence of the Seattle sound, and why it ended up manifesting the way it did. Even through punk, it just really didn't have that kind of oh, fuck those old bands, those old dinosaur bands. It's like, no, those bands were cool.
Yeah.
So that's my theory.
I 100% agree. Because and I it never really actually occurred to me that that was a Seattle thing until my own band gets out of town. We go up to Vancouver, and whatever we played, you know, I think there's even a tape of us playing Highway to Hell in 1981 somewhere. And we just learned a bunch of songs. So it's like, well, if we're going on a trip, let's learn a half a dozen other band songs so we can throw them in there, as extra songs or encores or whatever. We wanted to stick with playing mostly our own songs, but
Yeah,
you don't want to play the same cover songs every night. So it's like
yeah,
learned a handful of odds and ends, Badfinger, and like that went over okay, things like that. But you play Highway to Hell in 1981 to a group of opening for D.O.A. Audience in Vancouver, and they hated it. They started throwing stuff and spitting at us, and I was like, oh, what's wrong with you guys? Like it didn't even think about that was taboo. It's like, well, who didn't like AC/DC in you know late 70s and early 80s? It's like,
yeah, exactly.
well, I can tell you who people
Yeah,
that were
yeah. Some
devoted
people.
to being punk rockers, and that didn't go over so well. And it was sort of a head shaker, because it's like, well, who doesn't like Motorhead? Who doesn't like like, who doesn't
Right.
like these bands? It was like, wow.
Well,
And
remember, look at England. It's like there's all these punk bands like the Pistols and the Clash who are, basically trying to posture as if the old bands weren't valuable. And then Generation X was kind of a shining light, like, oh yeah, we like the old stuff. And
right,
so
we love Mott the Hoople. They're our
yeah,
favorite
yeah,
band of all
exactly.
time.
So just it depends. Some wanted some kind of purity to this punk, and other ones didn't. I think with the Living, it was interesting because they used to do a lot of 60s covers when they first came out, were more kind of aligned with that kind of, almost power pop, doing Hey Jude and Why Don't We Do the Road, Beg, Borrow, and Steal, Mr. You're a Better Man Than I. Later on they did Bowie's Cracked Actor, Ballroom Blitz. Really no problem playing those kind of songs. And even later in the days with the Living, they were always considering, other possibilities for covers. So um, but that's not something a lot of punks were interested in unless it was maybe another punk song by somebody else.
Right. You could play Rise Above, but you could
Yeah,
not play, Why Don't We Do It in a Road? Why?
yeah,
I don't know, that's weird.
yeah,
But there again, in Seattle, it didn't, it was just more cool music that we liked. I mean, who doesn't like Beg, Borrow, and Steal?
yeah. I know. Well,
It's like,
great
wait,
song is a great song, especially if you play it right. I mean, it was Fastback certainly is a great example of that too. I mean, look at all the cover songs you guys have done, and you've done them in with the right spirit and the right intent. And
right, and
you know, a great song is a great song.
right, and you can play it similar or not similar, whatever. Just don't ruin it, but you can take some liberties or not, whatever. And I just, the Seattle, I think, even back then, as we're saying, like, maybe did have something sort of special going on. And, also in, right around 82, bands, a lot of them, started getting more of a metal edge.
Right, right.
you know, not just in Seattle, but around the world, around the country for sure. And theory being that, you know, the metal scene in Seattle started going in 82, 83, and you know, it was sort of a absolutely parallel scene. There was, as far as I knew, there was not much direct, you know, cross pollination. The one, what was the metal skating rink venue that people
Oh,
went to?
out in Kent, wasn't it out in Kent or something?
It was out, yeah, on the east side. And you know, I was like, wow, you know what, I never went there, you know. But it was, there was so many things to try to get people to branch out of playing, because everybody loved playing kick-ass punk music.
Yeah.
But you know, there was, by that point, I'm just thinking of what that year was like. By that point there was lots of, you know, shirts off aggro assholes with their elbows out, you know,
Yeah.
beating people up at shows and just going to shows to fight. And you know, it was perfect music to fight to too, of course, if that's what your idea of a good time was. But you know, nobody in the bands thought it was cool to see people fighting. Well,
Yeah.
like,
Well, and then like you pointed out, eventually they started kind of cross-pollinating. I remember bands like RPM and whatnot that were punk and metal. You know, so they're
right,
let's
right. And
let's
but
kiss and make up first.
the metal place over in the east side, you know, girls would go to those shows, whereas the elbows out skinhead, you know, aggro punks would pretty much scare away all women from being
Right, right, right.
here. And like, you know, probably 70% of the guys too would have no interest in that. So, and you know, technology evolved in that you could, you know, you could get a pretty cool guitar sound, you know, that, and you know, there's the difference between a metal guitar sound and a punk guitar sound is really nothing other than the attitude of the person playing the instrument.
Oh, sure,
and
sure.
and so at the same time it's like, well, we've been we've been headbutting this door and it's not really opening for us. There's all the girls going to see the metal bands with long hair and hairspray. There's, you know, a bunch of people going to see the club shows with bands that don't play so fast, not so loud, and you know, play a bunch of songs we know. And you know, 82 was kind of the year of reckoning. It's like, okay, well, the living, you know, doubled down and got the you know, got the practice and got the sharp sound going of you know, frantic punk music. And you know, had at it for the better part of 1982. I believe the last show they did was Roscoe Louie Gallery.
Yeah,
That was the
yeah,
actual last show, which was July 30th, 1982.
yeah. And that I believe that was without John. Um, as I recall, they did one show at Roscoe Lurie Gallery just as a trio, but that might have been one other show.
Wow, that is an interesting
It's like 40 years ago now, so
yeah, yeah, there's a lot.
I'm not going to rely on anything that I can remember.
Right,
And there's some things I know actually really did happen, and I'll stick with those.
right. You know, like if you remember being there and you remember things that happened there.
Yeah, like talking to Kim about seeing The Living the first time with her playing bass, and she's like, "Really?" So, you know, but that's something I know truly happened. So,
Well, yeah, man, for sure, because you know, we were talking to Todd Fleischman. He was like, "Yeah, I
yeah,
didn't at the beginning. I think it was Kim that played the first show, because of course everyone would have gone to see, you know, Duff and Chris's new band for
yeah,
sure. Who wouldn't have gone to it? You know,
yeah,
it's like you were stoked, and you know, at that point, I was probably 20, Duff was probably 16.
yeah. I was probably
You know,
about 23, 24.
yeah, yeah. There was what, you know, not to say what else are you gonna do, but what else were you gonna do? They're your friends playing a kick-ass rock show, so we're
Oh,
on.
yeah. Well, it was so easy to get around in here back then too. You could go to every show, you know, and there wasn't one every night, so it was like it was spread out. And
Right. You'd look forward for the whole week to going to a show.
yeah,
I mean, now at this point in time, I would look forward a month ahead if the Living were playing at our own damn gallery.
yeah,
There's
exactly.
no shows, but back then, there was somebody's doing something great. Let's go see what's going on, and it was it was awesome.
Yeah, and I also like the level it reached by '82 too, because I remember going out and see some of the seminal bands in '76 and '77 and '78, and there was a lot of spirit there, but not always a lot of technique. So some of the ideas were kind of half formed, but it was still great to see bands, however primitive, playing um, original music. And since I'd lived in urban environments, my father was in the military, so we moved around a lot to military bases. I wasn't in an urban environment. I didn't see people like that. I didn't see people playing original music, And if you went to a party or something, it would be a go to see a cover band. I was lucky enough to be in Virginia Beach and go to a party, and there was a band that did nothing but songs by trapeze. And so
Wow.
yeah, and they were really good at it. So anyway, to come out here and find like all these, pretty young people. I remember Jenny Brott was a 45 buyer at the Peaches, and she's the one that told me about all these early bands like the Fish Sticks and the Radios and the Mice and everything. So I went and saw them. I remember seeing the Mentors for the first time at the Bird, and the Telepaths and stuff like that. But just seeing it, the evolution year after year was pretty impressive. And like you alluded to earlier, by the time 81, 82, 83, and 84 and on, all the bands were just getting more and more honed and better at their own visions. And then the next thing you know, we have bands here that could stack up against the good bands coming out of any part of the country. Bands like the U-Man and certainly the Fastbacks were a thread that ran through this entire scene, and both influenced it and reflected it. So, my hat's off to Seattle being able to step up to the plate, and certainly everybody now knows that as years went on, Seattle bands really stepped up to the plate. But to go back to our original point, a lot of that had the roots into that era from 79 to 80 to 81, 82. The roadmap was kind of getting laid out. And so it was
Right. Before that, there wasn't a roadmap. And then, in the 79, 80, the idea of a map had come out, but there was nothing on it.
yeah, but were any of us surprised when all this, we saw Mr. F in the early days, and then next thing you know, we see Green River and that sort of thing. And it's like, didn't really surprise me at all. I was thrilled, and it was cool to see these new bands coming up, but I can't really say the evolution was too much of a surprise.
Right. Because the people that wanted to play music, would keep reorganizing and trying to find something that would actually work.
Yeah, and
Again,
we love the Sex Pistols, and we love Blue Cheer, and there's not a problem there.
yeah, and of course we love Black Sabbath and Generation X and
Right.
Bad Brains and
Yeah.
and the Beatles.
Yep. Exactly.
But to get back to your other point though of Virginia Beach, and going, and as it probably was in so many cities, you'd go, if you're going to start a band, you just get together and play your favorite songs and try to get a show at a club opening for another band doing basically the same thing. So there was there was an entire disconnect between the bands that you would start, and because all the while people would be going to see shows at the Paramounts and the Coliseums and the arenas of the different places, so you'd go see these bands that were playing all original songs, that you buy their records and you do all that, and then your band would just be playing the songs of your favorite bands that you buy the records and go see the shows. There was pretty much a full disconnect between your band and the bands that you would go see.
Right.
and certainly, 1977, 78, the introduction of punk rock music from the US and the UK kind of gave you the thought that, oh, well, maybe we can do it too. And in my own case, it was absolutely true. We had a band. We tried to have a band in 1977, and we couldn't play at all. The drummer didn't even have a drum set, just sort of banging on maybe a drum and some other things. It's like with no rhythmic ability. It's like, well, how do you do this? How do you make the sounds of things? And then at some point we started, like, well, we love Blue Oyster Cult, so it's like, let's learn some blue. That's pretty tough, hard. And then, going down to the University District and the record store there, and you get records by the Sex Pistols and the Saints and the Damned, and it's, like, whoa, these records are killer. We can play this kind of music.
Yeah, yeah.
The drummer, then the drummer that we had was, he had some ability, but not, we had to, but you can practice all the time. If you're 16, 17, all you want to do is play music. I mean, even now, that's all we really want to do too. But you didn't have any responsibility. You could practice as much as you wanted. You can, in my own band's basement tapes from 1977 through 78, each one is a marked improvement over, how much better.
Yeah, sure.
And if it wasn't for punk rock, probably we would be down there playing, Beatles and Rolling Stones songs and trying to get shows at the, neighborhood bar, playing
Yeah.
four
Well, the
sets.
punk rock thing was great about, the fact that pretty much anybody can do it. So you're going to end up with, bands that really aren't that good at it, but are very spirited. And then, it's going to unleash people who had potential that just because, punk was so easy to step into, relatively speaking. Like you said,
Right, it was.
learning the Blue Oyster Cult riff is one thing, but slamming out some punk rock chords, that can be done. And so I think the fact that there's avenues opened up with people who maybe had great ideas but not as much technique. I mean, that's one of the great things about punk, for sure.
Right.
And a lot of people are inspired. I mean, you saw a band you were inspired by, and they moved you into that direction. And I watched The Living for 2 years, and had always been afraid of music and scared of it, like it's something that people who have magic can do. I'd played some, but after 2 years of watching them, I start playing music too, just because, once again, I watch what they did, and it's like, yeah, they can do this. It's not that complicated to work out the the basics. Playing music, writing songs, and things like that obviously is a step up, but actually having some instruments, making some racket, anybody can do that, and you could come up with some great results. I think the U-Men is a good example of that too. I remember their early shows and just thinking, man, I love these guys, but I'm not sure about that racket they're playing. And and then 6 months later, they're one of the most exciting live acts in Seattle. So
yeah. And some of those early U-Men shows were just fantastic.
Yeah. Or like I mentioned earlier, I still cracks me up when I'm working at Peaches, and I'm about 5 years older than most of the kids that are coming out and hanging out in the record department. And you guys come in and say, oh yeah, we got a band and stuff, and I'm like, oh, that's cute. I think that's great. You guys stay out of trouble. And then the first time going out to see you live, and it's like, wow, this is a real band. These guys are playing, and not only that, like doing originals already. I mean,
yeah, for sure.
And
that's what it sort of drove people, because just the phrase, "Oh, they're just a cover band."
Right.
It's like, you know,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah,
oh,
yeah.
oh no, those guys are just a cover band, and it didn't matter if you played, half other people's songs, as long as featured your own songs, you were fine.
Yeah.
Um, and because it's like it was so hard to decide, because it's like, well, we have our own songs, but there's all these other songs we'd love too. It's like, everything you could consider everything, but at the time, like, you wanted to feature your own songs, because you worked hard on them too, and you didn't want to be just a cover band.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was one thing you didn't want to do.
Yeah. And in fact, I remember when Garth Brandenburg, who a lot of people don't know, he was actually originally in some seminal lineup of the Living, as they developed, but was out fairly soon. And good friend of mine, but I remember he and I started a band, and it's like, well, okay, what's the first thing we need to do? Well, yeah, maybe write a couple songs. you know, it's yeah. Let's get together first, and then yeah, we'll write a couple songs, because that's how you get a band going. And
Yeah.
so Garth, I remember Garth whipped out a song, and then I wrote a song, and we were like, okay, we got two songs, we're a band, we're started. Here we go.
Two
So
people, two songs,
yeah,
band we have.
yeah, but and back then, of course, we couldn't get away with the old early '70s thing of like, all right, we're gonna have two songs, but the second one's gonna be 17 minutes long with uh, psychedelic guitar pyrotechnics for nearly half an hour. So
Which is interesting too, because that was absolutely verboten at that time,
yeah,
and then not long after that, even Black Flag, maybe not guitar, well, some guitar pyrotechnics, and
yeah,
some unscripted, um you know there again, they came back and threw a wrench in everyone's works by doing things like that. And it is, as we know, you can have a 1 minute song and attach an 18-minute improv to it, and you're fine.
right,
If you don't have that 1 minute song to introduce it, it's going to be a lot harder to sell people on an 18-minute free form instrumental. Not impossible to do that, but if you start out with a song and then let that introduce your next 10, 15 minutes of music, you're off on a good, it's a good way to usher in your experimentation. But of course, that was not even, that was barely thought of as being acceptable until a little bit later.
yeah, 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 exactly. When bands like Malfunction and things came out, I think we started moving more in that direction.
Right, that there could be some spaced out jams that
Yeah,
that had one
or
in punk rock.
or the stuff the Melvins were doing too.
Oh, for sure.
Because their trajectory, yeah, they, similar thing. We're like, oh, we're gonna have a 5 minutes. The opening of this song are just going to be a cymbal with some feedback, and so in a way, that's kind of just a different angle on turgid. And
Yes.
yeah, I think turgid is a word that we should make sure enters the vernacular of the discussion of pre-grunge, grunge, and post-grunge in the Seattle musical environment
It was
as actually an academic study.
a turgid time.
Turgid time.
Turgid, and the people too.
Yes, turgid people playing turgid music in turgid times.
And not to under represent the Melvins as a force in music, as basically taking the opposite of what anyone was doing,
Yeah,
turn it up and smashing it in everyone's faces. And I can't remember the first time that I saw the Melvins, but it was fairly early on down at the maybe the Grey Door even,
Okay, yeah. I think, yeah.
which was a little bit later than 82 for sure, but
Yeah.
not much longer after that when
Yeah, I
we
think 83 or 84 was the first time I saw him too. And,
yeah.
you know,
It's like,
I
well,
was down with it. Turgid, yeah.
this is really this is really taking me somewhere.
Yeah.
And they also had fast music too, and
hmm
are also, by the way, very good still. um
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
the last time I saw the Melvins was with Red Cross at Numos. Now it's been a couple years ago, but man, they just blew my shit out of the water.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it would take the live experience. I remember when Mudhoney first came out, I wasn't quite as wowed because their influences were so painfully obvious to me of bands that I really love. But boy, when they came back from their European tour and played the Moore Theater and I saw them live, it's a whole different thing. And that's, I think, one of the things about later Seattle bands and the living that has kind of a connection too, is where they're bands that are pretty charismatic and they're putting on a show, and you kind of see them and realize that this band is probably going to be bigger than this town. First time seeing Soundgarden, it's like, you got to be kidding me. These guys are rock stars. What are they doing playing in a hole?
The
And
center.
that's one of the things I mentioned to Brian Klein and stuff before, is that one of the things that for me about the living is they weren't really like a cool Seattle punk band, and they weren't cool because they were so young. And I just thought they were a great rock band. I like so many other Seattle bands who are a certain caliber. It just, you're seeing a great band wherever they're from. So it wasn't, kind of like, oh yeah, well, I get to hang out with them, and
Right,
that's,
it was like a magic combination of people.
yeah, exactly. So it's like, wow, I love this band on a international level. Not just like they're my favorite local band or whatever.
Right, right. They
That,
were a real, they were
yeah,
on a level of, the bands that, we would pay money to go see from anywhere.
yeah. And I felt like other Seattle bands had that too. The Fastbacks, the Silly Killers, the U-Men were all early favorites of mine. The Blackouts, and they all had a lot of charisma and a lot of thrust. There's another word we need to introduce along with turgid, although I'm not exactly sure if there's such a thing as a turgid thrust.
If there is, we've
We'll
defined
find it.
it. Um, Now, we still don't know too much about the actual recording session. Greg Gilmore doesn't remember that much about it. It was his first time in a studio, his first
Yeah,
time hearing himself played back. And, and talking to him, I was like, it's very notable that you didn't hold back. It doesn't seem like you were, as especially drummers, but pretty much everyone, Duff had recorded before, Chris had recorded before, John Conti, maybe not. I'm not quite sure if any of his bands had made studio visits before that, perhaps not. Um, but for a first time in a recording studio, for a drummer who had only been in this band for a few months at that time, to
right.
play so unhinged and
Yeah. Oh my
just
God.
absolutely going for it. I was like, well, do you remember anything about, that session at all? He's like, yeah, barely. I just remember being kind of nervous. It's like, well, it sure doesn't seem like you were. You're
He
just
doesn't sound nervous.
absolutely, absolutely going for it. So, if that band had been able to hold it together, because, whatever happened, people get, ideas change about what they want a band to be, or, people have little problems, or, whatever happened. It seems in hindsight that it would have been great for everybody to have put those problems behind them and just, kept firing away. And if they had sent those 7 songs to, some record label at that point, and somebody,
Yeah.
and it seemed like it would have been a perfect stepping stone to a killer rock career, really.
Yeah, but I think, I think it was exposed to certain people, and there wasn't that much response. Um, I think actually a great anecdote is Bruce Pavitt, who just had the Sub Pop, mixtapes back then. He
Mm-hmm.
actually approached the Living about putting some of their material on one of the early Sub Pop mixtapes.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the boys coming to me and saying, oh yeah, this guy, and we all kind of laughed it off, like, oh, that doesn't sound like much. Like, we don't want to put the song out on the cassette mixtape. And also Neil Hubbard, who put out the Seattle Syndrome records. By the time he did the Seattle Syndrome records, he was pretty much mostly into more new wave bands. He told me that, the Living, I submitted the Living for those records, and he turned it down because it just didn't really want punk rock on there. So it's kind of hard to say, because I mean, you listen to those songs now, any one of them on that demo should have turned some heads, and it'd be a notable addition to either the Seattle Syndrome records. But by then there was a certain sector of the town that was kind of going new wave, and the Living weren't part of that. But I would add that you kind of don't get the full picture of the band unless you hear a lot more of their material. And they had, this is only 7 songs. 2 of them are from later in their evolution, and they had quite a wide spectrum of songs. And one of them was actually turgid and long. For example, Burn in Sin. And Greg actually recorded a 4-track live at the Brook Lazat rehearsal studio. And there's a tape of that. And apparently Greg has found the original 4-track. But it's, the meters were just peaking on that thing. And it's pretty rough, but it does capture that ambiance. But more importantly, I think it had a wide spectrum of other material that's not represented in the demos that are being released, and completes a different picture. And I can see where a lot of the tunes might, some of the more power pop tunes that were kind of left over from earlier versions of the band probably would have been weeded out, and they would have focused in on the songs that just killed, like on the demo.
Mm-hmm.
But as you well know, we know about a whole history of rock bands from the 60s and 70s and 80s and on. And it's like you don't always get the full picture by things that are officially released.
No, and it seems like that 1982, recording, is pretty, it's pretty much of one mind.
Right.
Which doesn't tell the whole story, of course, because it probably is their 7 fastest, hardest songs, and that's okay. Well, this is what we're going for.
Yeah.
And
but there's some other additions that would have been nice. That song that Duff sang called Bus Line, that is on that 4-track recording. That's one of the songs I played for Larry Reed, and he pitched the record to Sub Pop based on hearing that, because he had mentioned in Facebook somewhere, like, hey, yeah, I remember the Living playing, man, they were a great band. And I was thrilled that he remembered, and somebody was mentioning him. And of course, I never missed a chance to go, yeah, the Living were great. You think you might know the local scene, but you don't. And so anyway, that Bus Line tune is out there in a live version, posted for people who want to look for it. But that would have been another great addition. So it's clear that they had a whole plethora of other tunes that would have been great to hear in the recording, especially because obviously they were very efficient. I mean, you look at that 7-song demo. I mean, they pretty much went in and laid it down and came out with it. As I mentioned earlier, I was completely stunned, even though I just spent 2 years with the band and was seeing him live every show they played, and to hear what they ended up harnessing in the studio was remarkable by any stretch.
Well, because we're also, so used to going to see bands and seeing these electrifying shows. And then generally, when you'd get a recording of a band, it would be, dimmed down to about 50 or 60% of what we actually saw.
Right,
And
right, right.
it was just not, and it's, of course, it still is hard to capture, you know, things like that. And bands more often than not, bet against themselves, and they're like, oh well, let's, no, we can't do that. They talk themselves out of, having the wild drumming and because it could be, thought of as being out of tune, or it could be thought of as being, out of time, or these things that are verboten in released recorded music, when, especially at that time, you wouldn't even consider recording something in your basement and putting it out on a record. There was like this thing. It's like, oh no, the record has to be, this certain way. It has to sound like every other record that was, you wanted everything to be, that way. And then, now you listen to some of these bands, even live recordings. A good live recording of a smoking band is just the greatest thing of all time, because it's not things you get anymore. And people, I imagine people just that love exciting music, it gets harder and harder to find something. The kids of today are not necessarily in the basement playing as fast as they can, and the
Yeah,
people that can
that
play.
live record is not going to add anything.
What's that?
The live record now might not add anything or present a different picture of the band.
Right. And the
You know,
people,
I look at a Radiohead concert, and then I look at MC5 Kick Out the Jams, and I'll take MC5 Kick Out the Jams. Like that article said, maybe rock and roll's dead because there's no mistakes anymore. It's almost the mistakes that make rock and roll.
it's the mistakes that define the people that are playing on the edge of their ability.
Yeah,
And that is, that's all we want,
yeah,
is people. It doesn't matter if you've been playing. Todd had been playing bass when they made that demo. He had been playing for a year
yeah,
max
yeah,
at the top. He didn't start playing bass until they'd ask him to be in the living, and then he was just like, I'm practicing every spare moment I have. I'm, just getting my hands to work, and because he was so excited to be in a cool band. And Greg, obviously, on the recording, holds back nothing.
yeah,
Totally going for it. The guitar, the vocals. I mean, everybody's just going. They're pushing their upper limits, which was just doesn't happen. There's no, like, people are, oh, our upper limit is this, so let's try to, make sure everything. We wouldn't want to speed up in a
yeah. It
because
sounds like you're playing for your life. You're playing as if your life depends on it. I remember they talked about that with Cream. It's like, in the old days they used to play like their lives depended on it. Now they play like their bank accounts depend on it.
right,
And
right. It's like
yeah,
they
but I
don't want
think
anyone to tune out. It was like, what happened to radio in the 80s. Oh, you don't want to play that song because it's noted that if some people hear that, they'll change the station. So they weren't reaching for the upper realms. That things were just going to keep people from tuning out. They didn't want to throw people things that they didn't like. And and of course, in a lot of ways, that happened to a lot of bands throughout the 80s. They wanted to play the nice clubs. They wanted to, make more than $50 for playing a show. They wanted to be able to,
wow,
God
you
forbid.
guys got $50? Really? What show was that?
I have some receipts. I could
Okay, I'll believe you got to show me those.
actually, $55 for a show
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. Holy
um
mackerel.
and like the thoughts, like the thought of actually quitting your crappy job because you were a musician, that was like, we wanted it all. We wanted to play the music that fired us up, and we wanted the thought of not having a regular job.
Yeah.
And it was sort of this unattainable goal. So some people stuck with the tough sound, and some people migrated to playing more regular rock that
Right, right, right.
that people could understand.
Yeah. I think mentioning the work ethic is interesting too, because that's one of the things that struck me about you guys, like fastbacks. What you're able to achieve, pretty early on by just being disciplined enough to focus. And you're probably laughing over there. Yeah, discipline. That's what we're known for.
Yeah.
But one of the things that struck me about the Living was, they were business, especially when Greg got in the band, and to see somebody like Duff that young, just really focusing on the work at hand.
Right,
And
corralling the energy and like, okay, well,
yeah,
here's what we got this week. We're practicing these days, and we have this show on this, like trying to get shows and get out there and do it.
yeah, but also just putting the work into, okay, we're doing punk rock, but that doesn't mean we need to, flesh out a good arrangement, or do something imaginative here, or practice this part so we nail it, or
I
just
read,
do
and
the
there was
nuts and
no
bolts.
realm of, oh no, we can't do that. It's like, well, let's try it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. So,
that's
that level of discipline, I didn't have any discipline back then, so it didn't really dawn on me, like, oh wow, look at that, if you just focus. But, like I say, to see, kids who are 5 years younger than me are just really focusing in on the craft and what they need to do to write a good song, and then pull it off, and then, play it with energy. Um, so I think that's a great aspect of the scene here. Was well, of course, for every band that had a lot of discipline, I guess we can probably both think of plenty of bands that didn't have discipline, and
for sure.
went the other rock and roll trail of debauchery over content.
Right, and there's and pretty much everything in between, like the combinations of people. If like the Living, where you had four people that were all very gung ho and of the same mind to work their butts off and get the music together and keep listening and keep working on things. And you could have one or two people that were slackers, or you'd get a band that could have gone somewhere, could have had some good songs, but it was for people who are all slackers, and they end up just being drunk all the time and never getting anything done.
Yeah,
And for sure, I mean, that is the curse of, and positive energy inspires more positive energy, and negative energy absolutely inspires more negative energy. And
yeah,
the negative energy is the stronger energy. Like as I was talking to Greg the other day, you can do all your practicing, you can have your band just shit hot, ready to smoke. You go to the show, and everybody's ready to go, but it can take one tiny thing to ruin the excitement. One asshole in the audience that says the wrong thing, or one person working the show, like somebody, there's one bit of negative energy can spoil so much of your work. And after a few of those things happen, you can be like, oh wow, well, we've worked this hard on all these things, and one thing has ruined everything. And but then you think of the times where there wasn't anything like that. The Monroe's Dance Palace, or the Roscoe Louie, some of these shows that the Living did, that nothing got in the way. It's I liken it to you start playing and your feet come off the ground like an inch or two. You feel like the band is playing itself. Everything
Yeah.
is just slamming. And I think that was what we noticed from the best of the living. And it was like a ball of fire. It was exactly, everything just went, and it was that
Yeah. Yeah.
magic. It was a magic kick-ass band at its best. And and I've had the same sort of feeling. Occasionally you start a show and you feel like you're levitating a little bit. You feel like this has a mind of its own, and it's like you're just like, please, nothing, don't spoil it. Let it see itself out, see itself through.
Right. And I would imagine it was the same with the fastbacks too, but with the living, I remember, when they got to play a good show with another good band. So it's like they're playing with the fastbacks, or they're playing with D.O.A, or they're playing opening for Husker Du, or they're playing with the Rats. Um, it always seemed to bring out the best in them when they were competing against another band. I'm sure you recall, and as I recall, the fastbacks were on fire that night too. But it's like, okay, you're playing with D.O.A, you better bring your A game.
Yeah, and that was a fantastic show. And I remember at the end of the night of that, Dave Gregg from D.O.A lit his guitar on fire in this little rental hall
Right, right.
with the ceiling so low Duff could barely, like, him standing up was about as high as it could get. There's the the ceiling was right there. And
Well,
D
apparently he could get higher because he put his head through the ceiling, as I
and
recall. So
could get a little bit higher.
yeah,
uh,
just a bit.
and I think maybe D.O.A knew that there was that they needed to pull out one extra stop for their,
Oh, right, yeah,
so they
yeah,
and I forget if it was I was aware of the fact that they said in advance that they were going to do this, and that when somebody said one thing from the stage, and maybe it was me, to turn off the lights in the place. It was the middle of the summer. It was 105 degrees in that joint. It was just awful. And the windows couldn't be open because of noise complaints, and because it was the loudest, it was the loudest show we could have put on for sure. And so, like, something was said, the lights went out, he lit his guitar on fire, and you know and that was a tribute to trying to have the last word on showmanship
yeah.
after.
Time honored tradition.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
In the firm tradition of you know doing it upright.
yeah. But I guess we're probably winding down. I'm not sure what the time is, but I would like to say that the whole idea of me as their manager is just a moniker. And the bottom line is, I was just their biggest fan, and I was very fortunate to see most of their shows. Didn't make it up to see them when they played Vancouver, but just to see them going through all their developments and know those guys, and get to see all these great shows, and the transition to the last version, so powerful, of the living. So a real treat for me. So it's a lot of gratification after 40 years. I might be one of the very happiest people on the planet that this record is coming out, because I've been a diehard fan since the day I first saw him. I've been championing him for 40 years. There's been numerous attempts to get the recordings out, and the fact that it's now finally not only coming out, but getting a really unparalleled treatment. It never dawned on me in a million years that I'd be living to read about the living in Rolling Stone magazine. So just the fact that this has come around full circle, and gotten this treatment, and all along I just wanted people to know that there was this other band in Seattle that were important, and now everybody gets to hear them. So that's my bottom line on this. Just redemption for them, and a particular redemption to Todd, who is just the spirit and the epitome of what was going on with the living. So to see his beautiful face plastered on the cover of that record, And of course, as Greg pointed out, they considered using Greg Gilmore's face, but they want to get some sales, and that would have just discouraged it too much. So I think it's a great choice that they picked Todd.
Todd, who picked up a bass the day he joined the Living.
Yeah, but boy, you can't what Todd has, you can't teach.
No, no, he was the right man at the right time.
Yeah.
And a tip of a toast to Stone and Regan for making the record come out.
Yeah, and doing such a great job on it. It just looks great. It sounds great, and I thank them as well. What a great thing after all this time. So now I can finally rest. My work is done.
My good work is done here.
Yes.
Yeah. I suppose the theory of band manager, it's it could have a lot of connotations, whereas in your case it was just being a champion of the band, a fan, and a cheerleader.
Yeah. Both a cheerleader for the band and for anybody that would listen to me talking about the band too. So yeah, and I feel like there was some function in there because whenever decisions were made, it was nice to have somebody else to bounce it off of, and so in that sense, I did contribute as far as where the band ended up going and helping them make some of those tough decisions to change the lineup and go in a different direction and work on different kinds of material and whose songs would get used and who wasn't. But yeah, other than that, it's like I didn't fatten their bank account, and I didn't get them to open for Yes at the Coliseum and things like that.
No, that would have been, I guess you could only guess what might have happened if they had stayed together past August '82 and kept playing, and it was a dynamite lineup, let's face it.
Yeah.
They could have gone anywhere and it would have been killer.
Yeah, I agree. But the bands seem to sometimes they only last as long as they're supposed to. So you can't really argue with it in the end.
No, and there's of course no reason to argue because no, they should have stayed together.
Yeah.
What you think should have happened 40 years ago just doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, you can't fathom it. I mean, it's like you look at a band like the Beatles, and it's like, oh, you're four guys in the Beatles, and you argue about whether to put a organ solo or a guitar solo on there, and you fight enough that you think about breaking up.
Right.
You're playing in the Beatles.
Right. And and ultimately you did break up, maybe not only because of that argument, and then both versions end up coming out. So
yeah.
But of course you're not thinking of that at the time. It's like, no, I want my guitar solo in there. No, we want the organ solo.
Yeah.
It's like, you just think of some of the dumb arguments, especially a band that is made up of 18 through 21-year-old kids.
Such youngsters.
Right. And the Beatles were probably, how old were they in 1969?
Well, yeah, they were young, but I don't know how young.
Yeah.
At my vantage point now, it's like anything below 59, I guess, would be young. Something like that.
And
like all those.
There's still
all right.
There's still some of us who never quite our musical excitement never quite grew above about 23 years old. Still
Right.
longing for that, just excitement. And of course, if you're 60 years old, it's so much less likely that you're going to be playing over your heads and testing your upper regions of singing and musicality, but it's still possible. We don't have
Yeah.
to give up.
Oh yeah.
We don't have to worry. We can do whatever we want still, and hopefully that will still be.
Yes.
Hopefully there's
Yep.
hopefully there's still some fire left for later in the year when we can start going to shows again and playing shows again and doing the things that we must do.
Yep. I have little doubt that the first live show I'm see with a live rock band in front of me, I'll probably implode
It's
because
gonna,
it's just been out of my system for so long.
yeah. All I
I've
ask
detoxed the rock and roll.
all I ask for is a 50-watt amp. It doesn't have to be a 100-watt amp, just a 50-watt amp and maybe 412 cabinet, two of them, one of them, whatever, SVT, a drummer that's all that's it's just there's so much possibility in that
Yep.
brew there. Take it wherever you want, but
Yeah, in
just
fact, they could come out and just play an E chord and sustain it and then stop the show. That would be enough for me.
as long as there was some
Let's
thud.
start off slow. Don't shock my system too quick.
Yeah,
Just play an E chord and sustain it, have a little feedback at the end, and then call at the end of the concert.
give me some give me some loud music, please. Please.
Yeah.
We will get it. We will demand it.
Okay, Kurt Bloch.
Right,
So I
Fox,
guess
it's
we've
been great talking to you on a Zoom call.
yeah.
And we'll have to figure out another time to raise a cup
Yeah.
and
So 40 years ago, when we were going out to see the living and doing that kind of shit, did you ever imagine that we'd be talking about it the way we are right now?
no, not in any not not in any part of this.
Yeah.
You just think that we just don't think you're living for the minute and the moment there, and you wouldn't even entertain the idea that there'd be any time that there wasn't going to be a steady helping of new bands playing kick-ass music, that it was going
Right.
to keep happening, like you starting to listen to kick-ass music in whenever it was. Didn't you start going to shows in 1972 or something, right? What did you say?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
68. 68. Went and saw Blue Cheer at the Eagles Auditorium in 68.
You were the wow.
And I saw Springfield Rifle playing at Green Lake, Seattle band. I'm pretty sure they were Seattle band. That was one of the first bands I saw live. And saw Iron Butterfly and Virginia Beach. But I really started going to the shows, during the 70s. So the usual Alice Cooper, Grand Funk, Deep Purple, and Black Sabbath, all the bands.
Yeah.
Yeah, I managed to see quite a few of them. So coming out here and seeing local bands was pretty eye-opening, because even when I saw all those big shows, there weren't very many local bands, and any bands I saw were in big clubs and big arenas, and so I wasn't exposed to whatever kind of local scene was there. I think Mason was a big local band in Virginia Beach that opened for Iron Butterfly, and they put out a record which I'm sure fetches hundreds and hundreds of dollars now. But to come out and see an entire city crawling with young kids who want to do original music was a real eye opener.
Playing loud original music.
Yeah. So being in the city and seeing the city rock was a good thing. I can't imagine what would have happened to me if I stayed out in the boondocks, but that wasn't in the charts. I was on a mission, and came out here and found it. So,
and I'm glad you did.
Likewise.
And I'm glad that I was born into it.
Yeah.
You know, there was not really any other choice for a lot of us. That's just what happened. That's what presented itself. And who would I be to steer the ship in any other direction?
Yeah. Well, and Duff certainly is a prime example of that too.
Right. And you're chomping at the bit, even talking, a year or 2 years before you actually moved to California about, I got to get out of this place,
Oh yeah. But I'm thinking even just like, oh God, here he is in his mid-teens and he's already has a pedigree of a bunch of bands, and, is playing some ferocious guitars, writing some killer songs. And, he's barely 17 yet. And then, he didn't wait around too much. He got out of this town quick to make it happen, and so kudos to him for that, because as he knew well, staying here, it could have gone anywhere or nowhere
if he'd waited around till 1990.
Yeah, exactly. So okay, Kurt Bloch,
good to have you aboard, and we'll pick up the torch where we left off.
Yes, sir. Yeah. I love you, man.
I love you, baby.
I love you, man.
I love you, man. Take care and have a fresh coffee and have a great rest of the day.
Yes, sir. You too.
Yeah. Take care, Brian.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Living 1982 podcast. Circle back for weekly episodes and find out about each week's special guests and where to stream the music by following the band's release on Instagram at The Living 1982.